Well, I just wanted to welcome you all here today to our training on generating expectations for student achievement, otherwise known as GESA, with Dr. Dolores Grayson, otherwise known as D. Grayson. And to welcome you to Metro, Batavia, which is a wonderful facility, as you can see here on our campus. And to say thank you for Dee for all her years of training people on this wonderful model of teacher-student expectations and being the mentor to many of us in the room over the years
Yes.
around this. So I wanted to welcome her to Metro's campus, Metropolitan State University campus, and Denver again. So welcome, welcome. And I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for having me, and I do hope that a few others join us, but if they don't, as I said, I've been known to dance with the ones who come, so we will move through it as though you are legions. You're going to hear a lot about me, as far as the work is concerned, as we progress through this. GESA has been a mission for me for the last 3 to 4 decades. I was saying to Moses that I did the first research synthesis to lay the groundwork for this in 1976. And we started building from that, and a colleague of mine, Dr. Mary Martin, had been the originator of a piece of work that Phi Delta Kappa was disseminating called TESA, or Teacher Expectations and Student Achievement. And Mary permitted me to take the 12 years of implementation that they had done with that piece of work all over the country and in some other countries with the Department of Defense. And it basically was based on a premise that teachers' perceptions and expectations correlate to student achievement, that there is a connection. And that was a landmark piece of work. She was one of the first people in the country to do that kind of work. Another colleague, another person who was doing work of that kind at the time was a gentleman named Ned Flanders with the Flanders Interaction Analysis work. And so those of you who have studied educational history, and I know I have teacher educators here, this goes back to some of the landmark work of some of the first peer observation work, et cetera, and Brophy and Good and lots of others were colleagues of Mary's along the time. And I ended up going to the Los Angeles County Office of Education to do technical assistance and training with 95 school districts in Los Angeles County. And I worked with the first race and sex equity grants that were funded in the state of California. And yesterday we were having lunch with Percy Morehouse, and Percy and I were talking about the fact that we go back to when the funding for the Title IV Civil Rights Act, technical assistance and training, first started. And basically, I believe that is still the funding that is the basic funding for the Western Educational Equity Act Center, which is now housed here at Metro State, and that Jan and all of you, many of you are affiliated with. And I congratulate you on your patient persistence and on continuing to do the work. And I loved Jan's description of the dog that caught the car this morning, because when you look at the image of the territory that they're expected to cover, it's like the work has always been, if you will, as far as being connected with any of the social justice or civil rights work, in that you're expected to work miracles on a very small amount. And that's not limited to social justice. It's true for public education. It's true for any of us who have been involved in education. We're expected to work miracles on a very small amount. And I said, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, there were some of us early on that thought perhaps we might work ourselves out of a job. We would just go around the country and make everybody aware of this and give them some good ideas of what they could do differently. And my goal, I literally stood up at one point, when I went to work at the LA County Office of Ed, I was at the California Department of Ed before that, and did teaching and administration and stuff before that. I'm older than dirt, so, you know, I've been around for a long time. Anyhow, but I literally stood up and said, my goal here, I was there to direct a new project, a new program that was funded under the Title IV funding, the same as the states that were funded at the time in the regional centers. And I said, my goal is to work myself out of a job. You know, my whole goal was to infuse this throughout my agency, not just make it this little separate thing on the side. And Jan probably remembers something developed called an equity infusion process that we went around and worked with equity staffs and taught them about, which we knew was a really good idea, so that you're not just the only one that's expected to do the work. But the truth of the matter is the issues that are tied to this keep growing and manifesting themselves, to the point that Frances had said, I can't believe you're going to do this in a day, because she knows that it was designed to be done in a much longer period of time. But what you're going to get today is an overview of GESA and of the GESA work. And because I know all of you are professionals who do turnaround work with others, with not only students but colleagues, I'm going to come at it from that perspective. And so because of that, you have, in addition to your agenda and the manual, the book that you have, which is a working book. Don't be afraid to write in it. It's been designed to have you do margin notes, etc. But you also have an updated bibliography, a revised bibliography that goes with the units, and I'll come back to that later. And you have, in the back of the book, you have the PowerPoint notes, the PowerPoint note sheets. But thanks to Frances yesterday, who suggested you might want a standalone copy of that, you also have that separate. So I want to make sure that you have. Terrific. Thank you so much. We will be doing a lot of dyad work and small group work, etc., throughout this day, so that you won't just sit and listen to me talking. A lot of this is based on people actually taking the work and doing something with it, if you will. And just as we're firm believers in involving students in their own learning process, we believe in doing the same as far as these kinds of workshops, etc. What I'd like for you to do, if you would please take a look at the book that you have. This particular book is a fourth edition of the original work, and it's a compilation of a lot of what we learned in the earlier years. And instead of my standing and telling you a lot about the history, etc., what I would like to do is to ask you, please, first of all, if you take a look, if you turn to the table of contents, you'll notice that you have a section on background information, and that includes the why, the rationale, a little brief overview, some history, a little bit about the research. We'll talk a little bit more about that because it has been updated a bit. And then you'll notice that there are 5 units, 5 content units. And then within the units, there's something we call an area of disparity that I'll come back to. And then there are 2 basically strategies that we've identified that go with that particular unit. And then as you go through this, you'll notice there's a follow-up section. And in the back of the book, and I don't want you to go there yet, but as you turn over in the table of contents, you'll see there's a section for the references, and the bibliography addendum updates that. This goes through 2012, and then the bibliography addendum that you have is one that I've just compiled that is through 2017, and I've sectioned it based on the units that it is most applicable to. And then in the appendix, you have a lot of things that are used as handouts. And those of you who teach here at the university, you are welcome to use any of this material in your classes, in your courses, as you see fit or as would benefit you, whether you're doing GESA specifically or if it's something. For example, you have some information in there on bias in curriculum and the forms of bias and sample sheets of how to go through and do a checklist on that. And if that's something that you find you'd like to put into a class that you want your students to be able to use, I've intentionally gone through and we've put notations on all of those appendix sheets that say permission to duplicate. And so just know that my purpose is to get this to you so that you can use it. And so anything that we can help, anything we can do to help that happen, we want to do. In addition to all of this, you're going to be getting, they don't have the cards yet, right? They're going to get those later? Yeah, you don't have to give them to them now. Before you leave today, you're going to get a card from the center with a chip on it that gives you, it's basically a flash drive, that gives you an electronic copy of this book, that gives you an electronic copy of the notes, the PowerPoint presentation, the notes that go with it, and the bibliography addendum. So you're going to have things electronically as well. And I have included in that a facilitator guide that gives you tips on turnaround training or on sharing the information. And I've given you a set of teacher handouts that can be used. So I'll go through a little bit more of that this afternoon as we're wrapping and as we're closing. But I want you to know that I came here attempting to make this as easy for you to take with you as possible, but I'm also sharing it with you now so that you know that you don't have to sit there and try to take every note on everything that we're doing, because you're going to get copies of everything. I mean, obviously, as I said to someone earlier, my learning style is such that I'm tactile as well as visual, and I have to be doing something to keep me here. Otherwise, I've got one of those minds. If I'm sitting in a conference listening to a speaker, I hear something, it gives me an idea, I take off, I'm creating, I've left the building, I'm gone, you know. And so lots of times I'll take notes just to keep myself in my seat. Do what you need to do that helps this be more meaningful to you. But what I want to do first of all is give you a few minutes and let you look through the first 11 pages, which give you some background. You don't have time to read all of it word by word, but I'm going to give you about 5 to 10 minutes to go through it and just to see if there's anything there that kind of jumps out at you. And after you have a chance to do that, then we're going to pick up and go with some of the points that I want to make with it. Okay? Any questions? As you read through that, you saw that this has been around for a while, and you saw that we have quite a history of having collected with colleagues around the country, and you probably saw some names that you recognized in there. The thing that I am most excited about, for one thing, I think that we have updated this on a regular basis enough that we've continued to kind of, it's kind of like panning for gold. You know, you keep looking to see what the nuggets are that persist. And one of the things that we found out was that we were way ahead of our game when we started it. Because a lot of the pieces that we identified, some of the strategies, et cetera, I was sharing with some of them this morning. People were in the process of researching those strategies, and now it's kind of baseline research that's available to us. And one of the examples I gave was the strategy of wait time. When we started this, I had to explain what I was talking about. Some people called it latency, some called it wait time, there were all kinds of things out there. Mary Bud Rowe, actually, as a science educator, was the one who did the work and coined the phrase wait time. And that's one that everybody has kind of gotten familiar with now. So that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about, that when we first started out, we would have to go through. One of the reasons I know that I can do this work in a shorter period of time now is because I don't have to take the time to explain that. Part of what has happened since 2012, since you have the background there, is that personally, I mean, I'm kind of semi-retired, if you will. I've said over and over, that for years I looked around and my colleagues were retiring and I'd make out a new 3 to 5 year plan, you know? And I spent a lot of years running all over this country. And then in about 2010, I had done a lot of work in New York with the teacher leader quality programs there, and with about 17 colleges and universities. And I referenced some of that. Well, they asked me to do an online course based on GESA. And so we've done a course on instruction to improve student achievement. And it's been used in their graduate program and their master's program there. And that was quite a challenge, because here I was running around the country talking about interaction, classroom interaction, interpersonal connections, etc. And I'm trying to figure out how to make an online course dynamic enough that people are going to feel engaged in it. And it was a good challenge, and it was, at that point we were using something called the Angel Student Network. Some of you may have been familiar with that in your background. And then because of the nature of the movement of what was going on and where the priorities were, a lot of things were going on with regard to action research. And basically what we had done was develop this really good action research model, an example of teachers working with teachers for teachers and feeding us the information back. None of this was done by somebody sitting in a room somewhere looking at stuff and deciding this is what we need to do. We did it with teachers. And so as this push, and I've made a couple of notes over here, as this push for action research has surfaced, part of what has happened with me is that I'm the research professor I teach the action research course for the master's program in the State University of New York system, specifically through Oswego University, SUNY Oswego. And through that, part of what I have found is that much of what we've done kind of parallels a lot of what the people who are specializing in, quote, action research are trying to encourage practitioners to do. And so we find that we have a really good model with some distance on it, as far as being able to give them some tips on some of the observation processes and some of the reflection processes, etc. And I just put a couple of the commonalities up here and tried to reference the names, and I think some of these are in your bibliography. But the whole idea, some of the elements that you see in most of the models, the action research models, are such as Mertler and Charles, planning, acting, developing, reflecting, trying to get practitioners to do that to improve their own work, rather than somebody coming in from the outside and saying this is what you need to do. Most of these action research models that general educators are doing tend to have some of the same components. Stringers, look, think, act, basically. And I mentioned, I've got Craig Mertler's, the 2017 is his 5th edition of his book, which is Action Research, Improving Schools and Empowering Education. And that happens to be a textbook that I use. I'm not here to plug books or anything, I'm just saying that's one of the ones that I use with the action research course that I do. I sit in California and work with a cohort of graduate students in New York, so I'm indebted to technology for keeping me going, if you will. And I have some, in the book, I've given you kind of a partial syllabus with tips for online instruction for some of this information. The objectives, as you noticed when you scan through this on page 5, the overall objectives, number 1, as the name indicates, is to increase student achievement. And when we talk about student achievement, you'll see in the back when we talk about assessing the program and measuring the effectiveness of it, we've measured not just grades and tests, we measure discipline referrals, we measure retention, we measure the kinds of things, self-esteem scores. Over the years, we've had people do master's theses and doctoral dissertations, some of which is rooted in some of these materials and some of this information, and they have continued to feed us information. Jan has been involved in this throughout her most recent adult career, yes, and has participated and contributed on an ongoing basis to the growth. GESA has kind of had a life of its own in the hands of people like Jan and Kathy and several of the others. Francis has worked with us before, and so today they're all getting a little in-your-face update refresher here. But the thing is that we haven't done this in isolation. We've done it with other people. So that was the biggest challenge right from the beginning. People said, oh, Dee, you're going to try to prove that you're impacting student achievement. And my standing line has always been from the beginning, from the pilot studies and the field test studies, we proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that we weren't doing any harm and that there was a very good chance that we were contributing to the improvements that were taking place in the GESA classrooms versus the non-GESA classrooms. So, over the years we've gotten much more refined at being able to show that that's happening. Reduce the disparity in teacher-student interactions. When we first combined and synthesized the literature with the equity guidelines in mind and with some of the historical studies, we identified 5 major categories, 5 major areas for focus as far as having equity implications and where students appeared to get treated differently or be permitted to act differently, if you will, and have some differences as far as the teacher-student interactions. And we'll go through those in just a few minutes. 4 of them are directly related to instruction. 1 deals with behavior management. Third, to increase the use of non-stereotypical behaviors, materials, activities, and provide more positive learning environments. And that's kind of a catch-all that we do. The 3rd unit deals specifically with the whole area of classroom management, discipline, et cetera. And then, as I said, in your appendix and in Unit 1, actually, we talk about the importance of dealing with non-stereotypical behaviors. And in a little bit, we'll get into some of the biased kinds of things in the stereotype thread, et cetera. We'll make some references to that information for you. So those are our three objectives that they've been tweaked over the years, but for the most part, they have pretty consistently remained the same and are still timely. I said this morning, I said, we used to have to tell people what we were talking about when we were talking about inequity. And today, all you have to do is turn on the TV, turn on the web. I mean, it hits us from all sides, at all levels, politically, in the entertainment field, all over. The difference is there are a lot of voices out there dealing back and forth with it. The key for me has been to stay focused on the kinds of things that make a difference within our profession. Not so much focusing on what we can't do, but focusing on what we can do. And that tends to be focusing within what I call our sphere of influence. The people with whom I interact, the people I deal with, the people I talk to, the people that see me model, etc. I don't have a lot of control over all of that out there. But for years, many of us have been working at winning this 1, 2, 10, 6, 8 people at a time. Sometimes larger groups, sometimes smaller groups. And yet, the idea is to do it in a way that people take something with them, that they each one teach one kind of thing, And it's not a fast process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. But we are able to see the kinds of issues we're dealing with today are rooted in some of the same factors, but they manifest themselves differently. And because of the work that's come before, we can see some gains, we can see some changes, we can see more people identifying some of it, and we see more people sometimes getting upset about it. So I don't want to get too specific or get into the politics of the situation or anything, but I've never felt that there was a time that this was a more important issue than I do right now. So that's why we still suit up, show up, put one foot in front of the other, keep breathing out and in and going, So, okay. On page 13, you have a copy of this matrix. And the matrix, down the left-hand side, gives you the 5 areas of disparity. And as I said, 4 of them deal specifically with instruction. Instructional contact, and that has to do with whether students are being engaged or participating in their learning process. And this is all tied to instruction. So it's not if they're interacting with you on, may I be excused, may I go to the restroom, you know, behavior things, all of that comes later. This is tied directly to instruction. The second one is the whole area of grouping and organization. How we structure our classrooms, where we spend our time, where they spend their time, with whom they work, whether they're always working with the same people or whether they're mixing up. And see, all of these, I know for you, even if you've been through GESA or not, all of this is we have all, as educators, gotten smarter about these things. And so that's why I know when I heard that I was going to have the people from the Teacher Education Center, I said this is going to be just a refresher for them. The main thing that I do for people like you is to let you know what's where, you know, what we've proven around is where to put your focus, where to put your energy. So sometimes I think I'm just kind of separating wheat from chaff for people and saying, you know, over and over we've seen, yes, you're on the right track. This is where to be putting the energy. This is where to be putting the focus. The whole area of self-esteem and self-concept ties directly to instructional, to what's going on in instruction. And the evaluation of student performance, which is Unit 5. You can see that Unit 3 is the one that deals specifically with classroom management and discipline. What has happened over the years is that the 3 that seem to surface as far as instruction, etc., is instructional contact, the whole idea of engagement and participation, the grouping piece, and the evaluation of student performance. The self-esteem piece seems to kind of get absolved within all of that because it does impact. But we broke it out specifically because of all the studies and the work that had been done on that. When we started out, everybody thought that was just touchy-feely stuff you were talking about. Today, we know there's, for example, a difference between esteem and concept and efficacy, okay? And there's been a lot of work and some rigorous research that's been done in that area that shows us that it is important what teachers do as far as whether they're calling students by name or spending time with them, et cetera, giving them feedback, and it ties in. The interaction patterns are observable patterns that you can actually go into a classroom, sit and watch what's going on and see what's happening. For example, taking a look at who's getting a response opportunity, and that literally means anything a teacher does to involve a student in their learning process. So anything that we do to facilitate, to initiate, or to permit, if you will, that student to be involved. Acknowledgement, it's a general category. Acknowledgement and feedback is a general category also, in that anything the teacher does to acknowledge that they've seen, heard, observed, eye contact, nods of heads, anything to let people know that you know they're there, you heard them, you have acknowledging their existence. So that's a general category. Wait time I mentioned already, the purpose of which is thinking. And you know it's that time between initiating the question or the problem or the pose and then someone or something interrupting the time, the space in there for people to process. Our first studies on this showed that the least amount of time, if I didn't think a student was going to respond, if I had a low, and these were tied to high and low expectations and perceptions. If I had a low expectation, it was less than 1 second. It was 0.9 of a second. The last study that we've been able to find that someone actually sat and clocked, and it was done by the Sadkers. David and Meyer Sadker. Or actually, David was working with a grad student on that piece when they followed up on it. But if I expected the student to respond, I gave them an average of 5 seconds. And so did everybody else. So the students pick up whether we perceive somebody as a high achiever or a low achiever, or, you know, if we're expecting that too. And they do it for each other. And what we have noticed is that these patterns that we identified become more ingrained the longer people are in the system. So, for example, in that first section, when we see the patterns of disparity as far as who's engaged and who isn't, and I don't want to get too specific on this because we're gonna be going into this a little bit more. But we notice that the patterns at the elementary level get more disparate at the secondary level, and by the time they get to you, at the higher ed level, well, people have learned to defer, they've learned to sit back, some have learned to control, and unless we're doing something to really manage that and initiate and lead that, if we leave it up to the students, if the student is a stimulus to our behavior, we don't break these disparate patterns. We have to take the initiative to do something different. And that's one of the persistent findings that we've seen. You can read this. I don't need to keep reading it. We're going to go through these. You're going to have a chance to go through them a little more, but you can see that they kind of lead. And when we do the classroom management piece, we look at some of the techniques, the reproofing techniques or discipline techniques, and we also give them some ways to analyze discipline data in their own classes or in their own schools or districts. And then the listening and probing piece leads into the kind of the ultimate instructional thing of functioning on a higher level, critical thinking level, and providing not just general feedback, but specific analytical feedback. And we'll get into a little bit more of what that is and what that's all about as we move through this. Okay, I just went through all of these, so I'm just going to give you your little visual reinforcement. I suppose I should have been doing this while I was talking. But you can see how they break out. So when we talk about the interactions, we're talking about these. When we talk about the areas of disparity, we're talking about the previous categories. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about this physical closeness?
Yeah. In Unit 2, when we're talking about grouping and organization, we're talking not only about how you structure the room and where you put things, you know, and how the students are working, but where we actually spend our time. And we define and it's stationary within an arm's reach of a student, or within about 3 feet of a student. It's not, and that tends to be kind of a general, personal space varies, and it's a cultural thing as well. It varies within cultures. But we have found over the years that, again, tied to the high expectations for a student, that teachers, the students that they expect the most from, they tend to stand within about 3 feet of them. They tend to work within about 3 feet of them. And so it's pretty generally at kind of an arm's length. They use the boards on the sides, etc. And so physical closeness is defined by us as that stationary within it. So it doesn't count just running around by it. It's if you actually stand. And for example, if I come over here and I'm working and I'm talking, I might be looking at you and talking, but if I'm standing here, my physical closeness is with Kathy and Moses right here, you see? And they know it. I mean, they feel me here, you know? And if I move and I come back here and I might be talking to Sue, but I'm standing here and somebody's observing my physical closeness, these are the 2 students they'd mark. And we find that teachers get what we call anchor points, but they also get something we call dead zones, which are the zones they never go into or they go. And students gauge where they want to be and what they want to do lots of times based on where we are. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail on these because I want you to have a chance to go into some of this yourself as we go through this day. But that's an example of what we're talking about. Is that okay? Thank you. Thank you for your question. And this tape doesn't destruct if interrupted, okay? So please feel free. Because we're a small group, I want you to get your questions processed. I don't want you to... Okay, traditionally the initial format that we did was a 1 to 2 hour workshop or study group, And in each of the workshops or study groups, we bring people together. They would get an area of disparity. They'd get the focus on 2 of the interactions. They'd learn how to record those interactions. They'd participate in discussions, review the resources that we had, the research, etc. And then they go back into their own environment. Now this is done in like a professional development format, or it can be done in a course format. It can be done in a book study format. And over the years, I mean, when we initially started out, this was like a 6-month process. We met with people once a month, every month, and in between. And they had teams of teachers that came together and then went back and did their observations and stuff. We know that that is not necessarily a realistic format anymore. But we have found that if you keep kind of the basics of this, that for example, you can work with a group once a week for 5 weeks or whatever. Or you can, as I said, you can do it in a course. I teach a winter course online for 3 weeks and I cover all of this. And they have opportunities to do some observation and do some reflection, etc. So it can be condensed. But again, stick to the elements that are important. And the elements are come together, get the information, or get the, they might be online, you know, get the information. I always have, even if they're online, they have a discussion format and everything that they can use, that they discuss with each other and they can chat. And then they go through the research, they see what the traditional patterns have been. The idea is, am I doing those patterns in my classroom or in my setting? And these aren't just classroom patterns. They happen in the work setting. They happen in faculty meetings. I mean, we see them like teacher to student, employer to employee, you know, staff meetings, etc. So the key is then they have a chance to go back and then they conduct their observations or they have somebody observe them, etc. The original format was that they would observe and they would be observed. And so they got to practice the observations and they got to practice the interactions or the strategies and be observed. So all that baseline data that you have in there, when you read the summary, the research summary, etc., was based on this kind of format. As I said, we know. And then that process was repeated for each unit. They did it a unit at a time. Hi, come on in. We saved your seat. I'll give you a chance to get settled in and then we'll find out who you are, okay? I'm Dee Grayson and we're glad you're here.
Okay, great, thank you.
You bet. Okay, GESA is based on these research premises. First of all, that people's perceptions about themselves and others shape their expectations for themselves and others. Because remember I was talking about if a teacher thought this student was really capable or if a teacher thought they didn't really expect much from them. Perceptions and expectations combine to determine how people act in any given situation. Perceptions sometimes are manifested in feelings. Feelings have a tendency to influence our attitudes. All of those things kind of come together and they tend to dictate our actions. So perceptions and expectations, what we have found over the years, over and over and over and over again, we've proven this, combine to determine how people act in any given situation. You walk into a situation based on your own perceptions and expectations, you make decisions how you're going to act, how you're going to interact, etc., what's expected. If I am a person in a position of influence, as each one of you is, if I am a person in a position of influence, my perceptions, my expectations, my actions, what I say and what I do have a direct impact or correlation to that other person's achievement, success, productivity, or lack thereof. Now, what I've said right there is that, for example, if you're using teachers and students, that a teacher's perceptions, expectations, and actions have a direct correlation to a student's achievement or lack thereof. Do you believe that? Anybody here that doesn't believe that? They've heard me say this 100 times too. I'm so glad, because that's probably one of the 5 most researched things we've got in the educational profession, you know? we have proven, we started again, back to Mary Martin and Flanders and all those people, back to the 60s, back to Pygmalion in the classroom, back to the old Jacobson Rosenthal studies. When they planted cumulative records, back when we had cumulative records, hard copies, in the teacher's lounge, and they left them and they had a list of students, and they had these students with certain scores and other students with other scores, and the teachers found them accidentally and started treating their students differently based on what scores they had seen. And what do you know, the students started responding to the scores, you know. That was back in the 60s. And since we've come forward, that has been proven over and over and over again. And that whole wealth of 12 years of implementation of GESA that I mentioned earlier, the Teacher Expectation Student Achievement Model from way back when, that proved it over and over in every kind of environment you can imagine. And as we've done GESA over the last several decades, we have seen it over and over and over. Not only that, we've seen this, as I said, we've seen it employer to employee, we've seen it parent to children. If I'm in a position of influence where just by virtue of the fact that I walk in, whatever my title is, and I have people that are subjected to that influence, this is in process. So I feel really good about that. That's a message I have enjoyed carrying, because I walk into situations, especially in today's world, and not just today, over the last several decades, ever since Nation at Risk came out, and ever since, you know, all the No Child Left Behind stuff, and teachers have been made whipping posts for any wrongs that are happening as far as kids are concerned. And I'm able to walk into a room that people haven't been told they've done anything well in a fairly long time, and tell them that based on any given day, a minimum of 60% of that student's academic achievement is directly related to what they do and say in that classroom. That's a powerful piece of information. You know, that makes me feel like, oh, this job is worth doing. And then if you tell me that like up to 20% of that is going to be directly related to what that student brings with them, and roughly 20% more is going to be what that home environment and the parental expectations and stuff, and I know that I'm in a position to do something about that student's perceptions, and I know that I'm in a position to do something with those parents and that home environment, my market value grows. My influence grows. So the whole idea, when we started this, and I have to tell you that our baseline work paralleled some of that Nation at Risk work. Early 80s came out. The difference was, at that time, everybody else was focusing on what was wrong with education and what people were doing wrong. We focused on what teachers were doing well. What are they doing with the ones they expect the most from? Regardless of gender, regardless of race, regardless of background, regardless of language. Oh, guess what? We couldn't do regardless of, because the ones that they focused on the most, that they felt were the highest achievers, that they thought were doing well, all started looking real similar. And what do you know? We found out there were some equity issues in there, because the majority of them were white, majority of them were male. You know, I mean, majority of them were coming from a middle or higher middle or upper socioeconomic class. Majority of them didn't have any physical or developmental disabilities. Majority of them spoke English as a first language. You know the stuff. You know the drill. You've been working with it for a long time. Some of you longer than others. So we knew from the beginning that there was an equity issue. Is my time up? Okay. So basically, I don't want to get too hung up, but basically perceptions work to shape expectations, perceived expectations work together to shape behaviors, what we do and how we act, and those correlate directly to achievement, success, and productivity. Now, what I want you to do, you have Post-its and you have cards. I put a little color in the middle of the table. That's the low-tech part right there. The high-tech is what Jackie and all of them are doing with this, you know, okay? We believe in multiple modalities, you know. So what I'd like for you to do is just grab a card or a piece of Post-it or whatever, and I want you to think about this thing called perceptions.
Okay.
And I want you to think about the people and the situations and the places in your life. And we're going to do kind of a condensed version of this activity. The ones who have been through this for a long time have done this a number of times. But what I want you to do is I want you to think about the people have given you the messages that have shaped your perceptions about what people are like, what they could or couldn't do, what they should or shouldn't do. And I'm just going to go ahead with this. You know, like who influenced your belief about yourself, about what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, and about other people, you know? Where did you get your perceptions? And I'm going to kick this. Now, when you go through your materials, when you read through this section in the book, after you've left here, because we're not going to take the time to do all of that today, you'll notice that we have an activity, we have people do what we call a perception wheel. And we have them take a look at all of their different sources of perceptions. So just so that you can get an idea, I'm going to give you the results of what the majority of people around the country have reported on this, and then we're going to do something with that. But what I want you to do first of all is just jot down, I'll close my mouth for about 30 seconds or so, and I want you to jot down 2 or 3 sources that you feel shaped your perception.